They thought the sky was empty. They believed the ocean hid them. Japanese pilots flew toward their targets with confidence. Engines steady. Formations tight. Minds focused on the strike ahead. They did not know they had already been seen. Far away, on silent islands, invisible eyes were watching. No searchlights. No scouts. No warning shots. Just signals moving faster than sound. Before the first bomb was armed, alarms were already ringing. Before the first plane crossed the coast, fighters were already climbing. The attack was no longer a surprise. The defenders were waiting. This was not luck. This was not chance. It was a web. A network stretched across the Pacific. One that could see through darkness. Through clouds. Through distance itself. By the time Japanese pilots realized something was wrong, the sky had already turned against them. The battle was decided. Before they ever arrived. The Pacific War was a vast ocean, a dangerous expanse where ships and planes battled under the weight of silence and uncertainty. For the Japanese, the idea of surprise was their weapon, their planes slicing through the clouds with deadly intent. But what if the enemy already knew they were coming? What if they were waiting for them, hidden in plain sight? This was not a battle of brute force alone, but of information. Long before radar became the lifeline of modern warfare, the Pacific skies belonged to those who could see the unseen. The Allies, faced with overwhelming odds, had a secret weapon that would change the course of air combat forever. A network of radar stations stretched across isolated islands, silently scanning the horizon, waiting. Waiting for the moment when every incoming Japanese plane, every bomber, every fighter would be caught in its invisible web. The radar did not wait for a perfect day. It did not ask for permission. It simply worked. And as it hummed through the airwaves, it saw the enemy long before they ever saw the defenders. By the time the first bombs dropped, the Allies were already prepared. The sky was no longer the domain of the attacker. It had become the battlefield of the prepared. In the early years of the Pacific War, the Allies faced a deadly disadvantage. The vastness of the ocean meant that intelligence was often too slow, too outdated, or simply non-existent. The Japanese, on the other hand, were masters of surprise. Their air attacks came without warning, overwhelming the defenders who could do little but react in panic. The traditional methods of defense simply couldn't keep up. No matter how fast ships moved, or how many planes scrambled from the ground, the enemy had already struck before they were even detected. The strategic advantage lay with the Japanese, as they knew where to strike. But for the Allies, it was different. They were constantly playing catch-up, attempting to predict the enemy's next move in a game of high-stakes uncertainty. It was only after Pearl Harbor that the Allies truly understood the cost of being caught off guard. The surprise attack, the devastation that followed, and the realization that their defense systems were woefully inadequate, this was the cold, hard truth. What had once seemed like an impenetrable ocean now felt like a massive, unpredictable battlefield. The Japanese had proven that war could be waged not only on land and sea but in the sky. And the Allies had no way to stop it. It was a scenario that could no longer continue. The Allies had to adapt. They needed to find a way to foresee these surprise attacks, to create a system that could see the enemy before they ever crossed the horizon. But how could they do this? How could they defend the skies when the enemy controlled the air? They had to look beyond conventional means. They had to create something that would allow them to see what the enemy could not. And that is exactly what they did. They built a system, a radar network, that would change everything. But it wasn't just about technology. It was about survival. The Allies knew that unless they could gain control of the skies, the Pacific would remain a theater of uncertainty, where every attack could be their last. The idea of using radio waves to detect distant objects was not new. In fact, radar had been in the works for years, but it was in the early 1940s that its potential for warfare began to take shape. Scientists and engineers, initially focused on improving communication systems, quickly realized that these same radio waves could be used to see through the air, detecting objects from miles away without the need for visual contact. The radar was born out of a need, a desperation to change the balance of power in the skies. But the development of radar was far from a simple task. At first, the technology was rudimentary, unreliable, and far from the sophisticated systems that would later guide the defense efforts of the Allies. Early tests revealed its potential, but it took the collective will of many nations, working in secret, to bring the system to life. The United Kingdom's radar development became the first successful example of this new technology's military application. By 1939, British radar stations were already in place along their coasts, warning of German air raids during the Battle of Britain. However, the Allies knew that this was just the beginning. To defend the vast expanse of the Pacific, a much larger and more intricate system would need to be created. The challenge was not only technological but logistical. The Pacific was a place of isolation, a vast ocean where the enemy could strike from any direction. The Allies needed a network, a chain of radar stations that could cover the entire expanse of the Pacific. It wasn't enough to have one station on a single island or one radar beam sweeping through the sky. They needed something more, a web of interconnected stations, stretching from the Philippines to Hawaii, from Australia to the Solomon Islands. The first step was creating radar stations on remote islands, some so small that they were nothing more than specks on a map. These stations were painstakingly constructed, often under harsh conditions, but their potential was undeniable. Once in place, they formed the first nodes of a growing radar network. It was slow at first, but as more stations were built and as the technology improved, the network grew stronger, its coverage wider, and its ability to track the enemy more precise. But there was skepticism. Not everyone believed that this radar system would work. Some argued that the Japanese could easily evade detection by flying low, by staying under the radar's reach. Others believed the radar signals would be too weak or unreliable to be effective over such vast distances. Still, the Allies pressed forward, knowing that their survival depended on it. In the face of mounting pressure, they perfected the system. They refined the technology. And when it was finally ready, the radar stations of the Pacific were prepared to give the Allies their greatest advantage yet. The game had changed. The sky was no longer a place of uncertainty. It had become a domain that the Allies could control. The radar network, now beginning to take shape, was far more than just a few isolated stations spread across the Pacific. It was a carefully crafted web, an intricate system of interconnected eyes that watched the skies. The Allies knew that if they were to defend the Pacific effectively, every inch of airspace had to be covered. No single station could provide the full picture. It was the combination of all these stations, working together, that would give them the upper hand. These radar stations were strategically placed on islands across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Hawaii, from Australia to the Solomon Islands. Each station was linked to others, forming a continuous chain that stretched over thousands of miles. They acted like sentinels, each one scanning the skies for any incoming aircraft. But it wasn't just the sheer number of stations that made the network powerful, it was their ability to work in unison. The radar system was designed to detect planes as they entered the radar's range, even if they were still miles away. Once detected, the information was passed along to nearby stations, which would then confirm the target's location, speed, and trajectory. This flow of information created a real-time picture of the skies above, one that was constantly updated and refined. The Allies, for the first time, had a true sense of the airspace around them. The fog of war was beginning to lift. As the radar stations came online, they began to form a synchronized web of defense. They could track multiple planes at once, calculating their paths and relaying that information to the next station in line. This allowed the Allies to identify threats early, giving them precious minutes, sometimes hours, before an attack occurred. And those precious minutes made all the difference. But it wasn't just about tracking incoming planes. The radar stations also helped identify enemy formations. No longer were the Japanese planes a series of isolated threats. Now, they were part of a pattern, a formation that could be anticipated and intercepted. The radar network allowed the Allies to predict where the next attack would come from and to prepare accordingly. The network also had a psychological impact. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Allies were no longer on the defensive. They knew when the enemy was coming, and they could prepare for the attack before it arrived. The feeling of uncertainty that had plagued them for so long was beginning to dissipate. Instead of scrambling to respond to an attack, they were now able to take the fight to the enemy, intercepting planes in the air before they could strike. The radar web was not just a tool of defense, it was a weapon of offense. The construction of the radar stations was no easy task. Many of these islands were remote and difficult to access, often requiring long journeys by sea or air. The conditions were harsh, and the stations had to be built under difficult circumstances. But the Allies pressed on, understanding the importance of what they were creating. Each radar station, each piece of the network, was a step closer to gaining control of the skies. As the radar network expanded, the Allies began to see the fruits of their labor. The stations, once scattered and isolated, were now part of a unified system that stretched across the Pacific. And as the radar network grew, so too did the confidence of the Allies. They now had the ability to see the enemy long before they could strike. The balance of power was shifting. The Allies had built a radar web that was more than just a technological achievement, it was a strategic masterpiece. By connecting these islands, by linking these stations, they had created a system that gave them the ability to track, intercept, and defeat the enemy before they ever reached their targets. The moment of truth arrived when Japanese planes, confident and unaware, began their march across the Pacific. They came with the familiar roar of engines, their formations cutting through the sky, heading for their targets. But this time, they weren't flying into the unknown. This time, they were flying into a trap, a web that had already seen them, a system that was already waiting. The radar network, now fully operational, was on alert. As the Japanese aircraft approached, they flew into the radar's range, their presence immediately detected. The silent, invisible eyes on the island stirred into action. The radar stations, which had been silently scanning the skies for hours, now locked onto their targets with unrelenting precision. It wasn't a single radar station that alerted the Allies to the incoming threat, it was the combined force of the entire radar network. The information flowed seamlessly from one station to the next, each confirming the enemy's location and trajectory. The data was passed along in real time, the web weaving together a map of the skies that the Japanese pilots had no way of knowing existed. By the time the Japanese planes crossed into range, the defenders were already prepared. Fighters scrambled from their airfields, climbing into the sky, guided by the radar's information. The radar didn't just identify the planes, it painted a clear picture of their numbers, their speed, and their course. For the first time, the Allies had the upper hand. The element of surprise, which had once been the domain of the Japanese, was now in the hands of the defenders. As the Japanese aircraft neared their targets, they began to feel the consequences of flying into the radar network's watchful eye. What was once an easy, unchallenged strike now became a fight for survival. Allied planes, fueled by the radar's data, intercepted them in the air, picking them off one by one. The once confident Japanese pilots, accustomed to striking without warning, were now forced to react, their carefully laid plans falling apart in the face of an unseen enemy. The radar network, invisible to the Japanese, had turned the tables on them. The defenders, who had once been blind, were now seeing everything. It wasn't just the number of interceptions that mattered, it was the speed with which they occurred. What would have taken minutes to detect and respond to in the past now happened in seconds. Fighters, already in the air and guided by the radar's signals, engaged the enemy as soon as they were within range. The Japanese pilots, who had believed they controlled the skies, now found themselves hunted. The battles were no longer about outmaneuvering the enemy, it was about being seen first, being detected first. And this time, it was the Allies who were in control. But the Japanese didn't give up easily. Even as they found themselves caught in this new system of warfare, they continued to fight with everything they had. Their planes were still powerful, still dangerous. But the radar web had stripped them of their most powerful weapon, surprise. The tide was turning, and the Allies now had the tools to win battles before they even began. The radar network had done what no one had thought possible, it had leveled the playing field. The Japanese, with all their power, could no longer strike with the same certainty. They were no longer the hunters, they had become the hunted. And the battle for control of the skies had entered a new phase, one where the invisible hand of radar determined the fate of every engagement. The consequences of the radar web went far beyond the physical impact it had on the battlefield. As the Allies began to intercept Japanese planes with increasing success, something shifted in the minds of both the defenders and the attackers. For the first time, the psychological balance of power was no longer on the side of the Japanese. They had long held the belief that they controlled the skies, that their surprise attacks were unbeatable. But now, that confidence was beginning to waver. The Japanese pilots, once certain of their superiority, were now forced to confront a new reality. Every time they entered the air, there was the knowledge, whether spoken or unspoken, that they might already be seen. The radar web had disrupted their sense of security, their belief that they could strike without warning. Every mission, every bombing run, became a gamble. The enemy was no longer invisible. The sky was no longer theirs alone. And that uncertainty, that creeping fear, began to change the way they fought. For the Allies, the psychological shift was just as profound. They had spent months, even years, feeling powerless, scrambling to respond to attacks they could neither predict nor prevent. But now, they were in control. They no longer had to wait for the enemy to show up. They could see them coming. The radar web gave them the ability to act rather than react, to take the initiative instead of always being on the back foot. It wasn't just a military advantage, it was a psychological one as well. The feeling of uncertainty that had long haunted the Allies was replaced with a new sense of confidence. They were no longer blind. They were no longer vulnerable. As the Japanese began to lose their advantage in the sky, their sense of invincibility eroded. The once unshakable belief that they could strike at will began to fade. No longer were they the hunters. They had become the hunted. For the Allies, the radar web did more than just provide intelligence, it gave them the mental edge, the ability to challenge the Japanese in a way that had been unimaginable before. They had gained control of the air, not just through firepower, but through knowledge. The radar web was not just a military breakthrough, it was a revolution in air warfare. Before its introduction, air combat was largely defined by speed, skill, and luck. Pilots relied on their ability to outmaneuver each other, to get in the first shot, or to catch their enemies off guard. But the radar network changed everything. No longer was victory determined solely by the skill of the pilots or the power of the aircraft. Now, information itself had become the decisive factor. Whoever controlled the information, the ability to see the enemy before they saw you, controlled the fight. This shift was profound. Radar gave the Allies the upper hand in ways that were unimaginable at the start of the war. No longer were they forced to defend blindly against surprise attacks. They knew when the enemy was coming. They knew where they were coming from. They could track their every move, even as the enemy tried to evade detection. This system not only turned the tide of battles, it changed the entire nature of warfare in the skies. The importance of intelligence, of early detection, was now fully realized. The Allies didn't need to be faster or stronger, they needed to be smarter. With radar, they could strike first, intercepting enemy planes before they could reach their targets. The ability to anticipate the enemy's moves, to respond faster than ever before, became the key to victory. The radar web transformed air warfare into a game of information rather than one of brute strength. What began as a simple technological solution to a problem of defense became a cornerstone of modern air combat. The lessons learned in the Pacific would echo throughout future conflicts, shaping the future of aerial warfare for generations. The radar web proved that knowledge, not firepower, could win the war. Today, the radar stations that once watched over the Pacific stand silent. The web that had once seen every Japanese plane before it arrived is now a relic of the past, a piece of history relegated to forgotten islands. But the impact of that invisible network, the one that changed the course of air warfare, still resonates. Its legacy is felt not just in the history books, but in the very way we think about defense, surveillance, and technology. The battles fought in the skies over the Pacific were not just won with guns and bombs. They were won with foresight, with intelligence, with the ability to see what others could not. The radar network was more than just a technological marvel, it was a symbol of how knowledge, when harnessed, can shift the balance of power. What the Japanese had once taken for granted, the element of surprise, was taken from them. And in its place, the Allies gained something far more powerful: control. The radar web did not just change the outcome of the Pacific War. It changed the nature of warfare itself. In the end, the battles that shaped the course of history were not always decided by the strength of the armies or the ferocity of the weapons. Sometimes, they were decided by the ability to see, to anticipate, and to act before the enemy even knew they were being watched. And that, in itself, made all the difference.